Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Paul Virilio's essay, The Last Vehicle. This is from 1986, and as the title would suggest, one of the most important concepts in this essay is the idea of the vehicle. And this has to do with Virilio's focusing on the way speed affects our consciousness, the way it affects how we act in the world, how we perceive the world, and the implications this has for our way of life as we interface with technologies. Virilio opens with a little quote that really sets the scene for the entire essay. He writes, "In Tokyo, there is a new indoor swimming pool, equipped with a basin of intensely undulating water in which the swimmers remain in one place. The turbulence prevents any attempt to move forward, and the swimmers must try to advance just to hold their position. Like a kind of home trainer or conveyor belt on which one moves against the motion of the belt, the dynamics of the currents in this Japanese pool have the sole function of forcing the racing swimmers to struggle with the energy passing through the space of their confluence. An energy that takes the place of the dimensions of an Olympic pool, just as the belts of a home trainer replace stadium racetracks." And we can see right here a problem existentially for what this kind of device means. It means that, at least in this particular situation, all motion is intended to stave off the possibility of real change. It's sort of a dream of motion in which the struggle against impeding motion paradoxically leads to a moment of no actual motion taking place. So Virilio is going to extrapolate this sort of imagery to the entirety of society. And Virilio is going to take his idea of dramology, which is the philosophy of speed, and extrapolate that into, well, what does that mean for movement? Virilio writes, "In such cases, the person working out thus becomes less a moving body than an island, a pole of inertia, an inordinate instant offering a substitute for expanses and long stretches of time. Space no longer expands. Inertia replaces the continual change of place." And this hints on one of the main themes of Virilio's philosophy, is that traditionally when we're talking about society, this involves talking about spaces. How are spaces mapped? Maybe this is the territory of a country, and society is predicated on the stability of space, on controlling the rate of change of space, because, right, all sorts of empires are going to come up against each other, and their spaces are constantly being contested. But Virilio shows how what's actually being concerned with in society, particularly in modern societies that develop militaries, is controlling rates of change, which is to say, speed and acceleration. So what defines how we live, what defines our existential condition for Virilio, is our rate of change, which is to say, our acceleration. So our relation to time is primary in terms of giving us a sense of grounding. Because one of the things that goes along with time is, you might have the same amount of space to cover. For example, in the case of museums, where Virilio says that you have more exhibits being crammed into the same amount of space, such that you have twice the amount of space to cover and twice as little time to spend in any one place. So as the efficiency of spaces are being optimized, you get this rushing through every single space, just like this swimming pool in Tokyo, where you have to fight against this current, which is, a greater and greater impediment, such that it can fight you just enough to keep you in a state of overload. Virilio writes, "The acceleration of the visit is conditioned by the area of the exhibition. Too much space, too little time, and the museum welters in useless expanse that can no longer be furnished with works of art." So right, in these museums, for example, the shift is away from art as such, a sort of kind of idealist notion of what a museum is, until, into the idea of, how can I make this space the most profitable? How can I circulate as many people through this space as quickly as possible so that I can get more money? And Virilio says that this is going to change the way we interact with spaces because the speed of our proliferation changes. Such that while we were once at a point where we could just, sit there and ponder a work for longer and longer, it becomes less and less the case where we can actually sit and ponder in any aspect of life. But there's a sort of ignoring of genuine being for Virilio in the place of moving images that are subject to what he calls the excessive zeal of the viewer. And this is really the headspace of a sort of boundless consumerism, of shortened attention spans, of, as he says, the more impressive the size of the volumes presented, the quicker he tries to escape. There's an amateur who seems to have to be forced to fixate for more than only a moment. And to me, that epitomizes like TikTok, right? There's these quick, 15-second clips. And then when you get to a clip that's 3 minutes long, you have to force yourself to sit there and listen to the whole thing. And usually you'll just quit and go to the next thing and get your next dopamine response. And something like TikTok is just indicative of this increasing speed of consciousness. And I had a professor who was like, "You young people have shorter attention spans than anyone else." It's like, let's be more specific. It's not something inherent to young people, right? It's anyone who is socialized into a sort of existential tempo, a rate at which you have to move through the world that alters your attention span that you're used to. And, maybe an older person might be used to a slower tempo of life, whereas today we have things like information flow, which is extremely fast. We can get, information about news within minutes of it happening. News stories can be put out really quickly on the same day, and we can learn about some terrible earthquake that happened or something like that. So the tempo of life increases. And what is being created here in terms of spaces, and this is one of Virilio's most important kind of vantage points, because Virilio is not only a theorist, but an architect. So he's worried about the construction of spaces, and how does the construction of spaces change to accommodate this increasing speed. He says it leads to laboratories of a heightened perception that is never the perception of the passerby, this passing viewer distracted by his exertion. And being distracted by one's exertion is precisely the sort of condition that Virilio is so keen to point out. That we become absorbed not in the spectacle of art or whatnot, but we get absorbed in the spectacle of, for example, having something to say about a piece of art, and having something to say about a lot of pieces of art, which means kind of passively engaging with as many different pieces of information as you can, such that you can give some nice scholarly sounding opinion. And, one may get this when they're reading a piece of philosophy, for example, where, you've never read Paul Virilio before, so you try to read a piece of his work just so you can kind of get a grasp on what he's trying to say, just so you can, maybe talk bad about him or give some sort of fluffy sounding opinion. And Virilio is very aware of that we become distracted by our own exertion in trying to match the tempo of society. This leads for him to, quote, the advent of a final generation of vehicles, of means of communication over distances no longer associated with the revolution of transport, as if the conquest of space ultimately only confirmed the conquest of mere images of space. And I think this is epitomized, for example, in military intelligence technologies, which Virilio talks a lot about in Speed and Politics. How one can get, for example, a statistical map of the layout of the battlefield, of where troops are, of where the borders lie. We see this a lot, for example, today in the Russo-Ukrainian war, where you can get live, like updated by the hour maps showing like heat maps of where all the tensions are in the territory and where drawn political boundaries are versus where actual strategic boundaries are in terms of who controls what territory militarily. And this is the sort of conquest of images he's talking about, where now the vehicle is, propelled at such a rate that, whether this is bombs or whether this is, some sort of gas that can be volleyed, some sort of biological weapon, we conquest space through the conquering of the images of space, of how can we present our territory in such a way that people believe that we have control of it. To really epitomize the conquest of time over space, Virilio writes, "The revolution of transport will coincide with a characteristic change in the meaning of arrival, with a progressive negation of the time interval, the accelerated retention of the duration of passage that holds arrival and depart. Spatial distance collapses suddenly into mere temporal distance. The longest journeys become scarcely more than simple intermissions." And he's talking here about Einstein, who often uses train analogies in order to explain special and general relativity, where, inertia depends on an inertial reference frame, on how if you're standing on a train, once your inertia matches the inertia of the trains, you feel as if you're stable. So even though, you're moving at these tremendous speeds, you get used to a speed, and after an acceleration has happened and you get back to a stable speed, you feel as if you're stationary. So what matters is not so much speed, but acceleration. Speed is a rather arbitrary parameter, totally depending on your frame of reference from which you derive speed. And Einstein was brilliant for showing that. But what that means is that, for example, with weapons technologies of like ICBMs, of trying to, shoot further and further distances, it becomes a question of how quickly can I accelerate a body to another place in such a way that I abolish the strategic value of distance, where my territory is defined not only by what I politically control, but by how far can I reach with a missile, for example, and how quickly can I do it. So in the same way, spatial distances, it kind of collapses as a concept because with the sphere of influence of speed, which is epitomized in like ICBMs, it is now just a question of who can kill each other fastest, basically. He says, from now on, everything will happen without our even moving, without our even having to set out. The initially confined rise of the dynamic, first simply mobile, then automotive vehicle, is quickly followed by the generalized rise of pictures and sounds in the static vehicles of the audiovisual. And a great example of this is flight simulators. Flight simulators is something that Virilio talks about a lot in this essay. And the flight simulator is perfect because when it first came out, it was just simulating flight to get people used to flying without the danger of actually flying. But of course, they knew they weren't actually flying. Now, people can remotely pilot aircraft via flight simulators, such that they can actually fly without actually flying. They can actually move without having moved. And that's exactly Virilio's point that he's trying to make. He writes, each of these visions, these optical or acoustical images of the perceived world, represents a vehicle, a communication vector inseparable from the speed of its transmission. So again, what's important for Virilio is speed of transmission, not necessarily what's being transmitted, not necessarily the space that's covered, but the speed of that transmission. There's, as he says, a new priority of arrival over departure. And the epitome of this is where he writes, finally, the dynamic land vehicle, the most symptomatic of this sporting involution, is the dragster and the hot rod, whose motto could be, how can I get nowhere, or at least as close to it as possible, 400, 200 yards, but with ever-increasing speed. So, right, you're going on a journey to nowhere. It's just a fascination with speed as such. And he says, once this move, this duplication of accessories, furniture, the hi-fi chain, radio telescope, telex, and video mobile, turning the means of a long-haul transport into a means of transport in place, into a vehicle of ecstasy, music, and speed. And a good example of kind of making sense of this quote would be the opera of the 747, of the Boeing 747. That's a quote from The Aesthetics of Disappearance, where you're moving at these tremendous speeds in the Boeing 747, but you get to sit back nice and comfortable right as if you were at home. There's an emphasis on comfort, on making you feel as stable as possible in a contradictorily speeding body, such that not only is the 747 a vehicle of ecstasy, transport in place, but your own consciousness, your own way of life is defined as transport in place, as habitable circulation, as he calls it in Speed and Politics. And if you think about the fact that, for example, automobiles and airplanes are more important than ever for like businessmen just going about their daily lives, we are more and more defined by this truncation of the notion of distance in place of how quickly can I get to however many places in one day. As we come to a closing, he writes, if time is history, then velocity is only its hallucination. It ruins any expansion, extension, and any chronology. And this is kind of coinciding with Virilio speaking of this kind of collapse of history, because we're focused on grappling on to the very momentary being that we inhabit. You know, considering that from moment to moment, you're constantly changing speeds, changing what information you're interacting with, constantly changing. And, you know, this is a common theme in Virilio, is it's just kind of too much for him. And I'm sure it's too much for a lot of us. Of, you know, most people can't survive going their whole life with one job anymore. They have to have at least 2 or 3, and many more for most people. Virilio concludes that from now on, reality is concealed in the flatness of pictures, in the transference of representation. It conditions the return to the house's state of siege, to the cadaver-like inertia of the interactive dwelling, this residential cell that has left the extension of the habitat behind, and whose most important piece of furniture is the seat, this ergonomic armchair of the handicap's motor, and, who knows, the bed, a canopy bed for the infirm voyeur, a divan for being dreamt of without dreaming, a bench for being circulated without circulating. And this insistence on the themes of transference, of dwelling itself being something interactive which gets shifted from place to place, this can be best explicated with the collapse of the work-life balance today, where there's no longer this separate work life over here and home life over here. Now your home, in the sense of your place of comfortability, of your home away from work. This could be your own body. This could be your state of mind. It is combined with work such that, you can work from home now. And working from home is the epitome of the transference of work as such into the very heart of our way of being, where we ourselves become a residential cell confined to work and to a constant state of siege, of movement, of being a vehicle which is utilized for various societal reasons. So I hope this helps understand Virilio's thought a little bit. Obviously, the vehicle is one of the most important parts of this essay. Check out any of my other content that I've done on Virilio if you want to learn more or, get more nuance into his thought. It's not exactly easy, and he thrives off of being particularly dense and particularly unknown. At one point, he literally just puts, "What am I saying?" in the middle of a sentence, which to me highlights the profound confusion of the reader who might be thinking, "What am I reading?" So definitely don't feel any pressure if you don't understand this kind of work to a significant degree. Check out any of my other work that I've done on other postmodernists, German idealists, gender theorists, and other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom that you can tailor to your needs. That's it, and I'll see you in another lecture.